Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I'd like to introduce you to another chilling case that has not only shaken Australia but has resonated around the world. If you're interested in true crime stories, mysteries, and the psychological aspects of the darkest events, be sure to stick with this video until the end. Today we'll take a look together at the shocking case of Raina Thaiday, sometimes referred to as the Cairn tragedy. This case happened in the Australian city of Cairns in December of the year 2014. From the very beginning, it was clear to everyone that something utterly incomprehensible and heartbreaking had taken place. 8 young children were found dead in the family home, and it was their mother, Raina Thaiday, who was at the center of attention. Before we go into a more detailed analysis of the event itself, I would like to warn you that the story I'm going to talk about today is a very sensitive one, involving themes of violence against children and mental illness. If these topics are too heavy for you or if you have personal experience with them, please consider whether you want to continue watching. I would also like to start by thanking you for your support and the great community we are building together here. Your comments, shares, and subscriptions always motivate me incredibly to make more videos. If you're new here, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing and leaving me a comment or like below the video. Your feedback is hugely important to me and helps me improve the content I create for you. Now, let's take a moment to return to the Australian tropical city of Cairns, to the quiet Manoora neighborhood where the Thaiday family lived. Up until then, it was considered ordinary, perhaps a little secluded, but most of the neighbors never observed anything out of the ordinary. But everything changed one December morning when police discovered 8 small bodies in the house, and Raina Thaiday in a state of utter shock. Why did such a horrific tragedy occur? What all went on in the mind of a mother who decided to touch the lives of her children? What were the circumstances of this case, and how did Australian society and the media react to it? We'll talk about all of this today in a video that will not only be a reconstruction of events but also a reflection on what can lead a person to such a desperate act. To conclude the introduction, I would like to remind you that true crime cases are not just sensational. They are real events that have had a tragic impact on the lives of many people. That is why I try to treat them with the utmost respect and empathy. If you have any questions or comments about the case, be sure to drop me a line in the comments. Now let's delve together into the story of Raina Thaiday and try to understand what led to one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history. If we go back to that December day in the year 2014, we find ourselves in a quiet area of the Australian city of Cairns, where an unassuming house stands at Murray Street in Manoora. It was here that a tragedy took place that changed the lives of many people forever and deeply affected the whole of Australian society. In the early hours of December 19th, 8 bodies of children of various ages were found in this house. At that moment, the house was surrounded by a silent, almost palpable heaviness that no one could yet properly comprehend. The usual tranquility of a tropical morning was suddenly interrupted by the sound of sirens, which summoned not only the police, but later also rescue workers and forensic experts. Every step the police and paramedics took in the house that day only deepened their dismay and grief. The discovery of the bodies was not accidental. The house was relatively small, the interior typically furnished for a larger family. In all rooms, including the bedrooms, there were signs of everyday family life, as if it were a normal domestic morning. But in the sudden, contrasting darkness of this tragedy, the everyday turned into something terrifying. According to official reports and testimonies, the bodies of the children were found in different parts of the house. Some children were lying in their beds, others were discovered on the floor. At first glance, it was clear that the situation was not accidental and that the children had died a violent death. The police homicide investigation unit was immediately called in to investigate the murders and secure the scene. The 8 young victims ranged in age from 18 months to 14 years. They were Raina's own children and also her niece, who had lived with the family for a long time. Each of these children had a life yet to live, with unique dreams, interests, and joys. The youngest of the children was a little girl who was only 18 months old. The oldest was a 14-year-old girl who was already on the verge of adolescence. Among the victims was a girl who was Raina's niece. She was as important to the family as the other children. They had all grown up together as siblings, sharing not only their rooms but also their daily joys and worries. Raina Thaiday was the mother of 7 of these children. She cared for her niece as her own. The children attended the local school and were known in the neighborhood as quiet, sometimes shy but polite and well-mannered. Neighbors would see them playing in the garden, sometimes accompanied by their mother, sometimes with other children from the neighborhood. No one in the neighborhood suspected that the family might be facing any serious problem. The whole incident came to light in the early hours of the morning when the local police were contacted. Officers from the Cairns Police Department were the first to enter the house. They were called to the scene by a man who was a relative of the family and was trying to get inside when he found it impossible to make contact with anyone in the family. At that moment, he had no idea of the tragedy he would discover. When the officers arrived, the sight they were presented with was absolutely horrifying. The entire house was quiet, but in one of the rooms, Raina Thaiday was found in a distraught state, reportedly with superficial injuries. They immediately called the ambulance service, who treated the woman and later took her for further examination. Meanwhile, word began to spread that there were more victims in the house. Officers searched all the rooms in turn. The moment they began to remove the bodies of the children, groups of neighbors began to gather around the house, who were in complete shock. Some of them burst into tears. Others tried to understand what had happened. News of the tragedy quickly spread throughout the neighborhood and people tried to support each other. Everyone was horrified not only by the number of victims, but also by the fact that these were children they knew personally. Some neighbors said they heard unusual noises at night or early in the morning, but most of them did not notice anything strange. Everything seemed to be business as usual until police and paramedics arrived on the street. The officers immediately cordoned off the entire house and its surroundings. They set up a corridor where only investigators could walk and tried to prevent the public from entering. Forensic technicians began collecting evidence, taking photographs and carefully documenting every detail. It was clear at that point that the investigation would be very complex and would require the utmost care, as it was a multiple child murder. The first information appeared in the media the same day, including statements from police officials who confirmed that the situation was serious and that this was one of the most tragic investigations they had ever encountered. When investigators first entered the house, they described the atmosphere as unusually calm but oppressive. There was a mixture of tension, sadness, and something hard to grasp in the air. According to the information available, the house still showed signs of being a place where, until recently, normal family life had gone on. The remains of breakfast were left on the table, toys were scattered in the children's rooms, and there was still warm bathwater in the bathroom. Police officers and forensic experts tried to map the situation as quickly and carefully as possible. Everything had to be documented down to the smallest detail, so that it would be possible to reconstruct exactly what had happened in the house and in what order. Investigators also take note of small details such as prints, stains, bent objects, or unusual arrangements of things. Every detail could be important in understanding the tragedy. At the same time, crisis intervention was called to the scene for the intervening police officers and paramedics, as the sight of the dead children and their mother was very emotionally difficult for everyone. Some of the police officers present later testified that they would never forget the experience and that it was deeply etched in their memories. After securing the crime scene, the authorities immediately began to carry out all the necessary actions. It was necessary to secure evidence, to interview direct and indirect witnesses, and to try to find out as quickly as possible exactly what had happened in the house. In such sensitive cases, it is extremely important that nothing is overlooked, and that all information is preserved in as original a state as possible. At the same time, the local community spontaneously started to organize commemorative events and express their condolences to the family. People started to bring flowers and light candles in front of the house where the tragedy took place. The public and the media were waiting for official information, and everyone was eager for answers. But at that moment, no one had any. The whole day was extremely difficult for everyone involved. Investigators worked endlessly, trying to piece together the pieces of information and create the first complete picture of what really happened at the Manura house. They all hoped that they would soon learn what had led to this terrible tragedy and what its true course had been. As soon as the police arrived on the scene, an extensive investigation began, which had to be carried out with the utmost care and systematicity. The first key task of the investigators was to secure the entire area of the house and its surroundings so that there would be no disturbance of potential evidence. The perimeter of the house was taped off and access was restricted to specialist units only. The police officers in charge of the initial search paid close attention to all the details, as every moment, however slight, could be crucial to understanding the tragedy. It was essential to carry out a thorough documentation of the entire crime scene. All rooms were captured photographically and by video before any objects were moved. Forensic technicians took fingerprints, hair and fiber samples, biological traces, and other important clues that could later shed light on the course of events. It was also important to record the exact disposition of the bodies, securing all traces of blood and other signs of violence. Part of the initial securing of the crime scene also included preventing journalists or curious neighbors from reaching the site, which proved very difficult precisely because of the extraordinary media coverage of the case. In parallel with their work at the crime scene, the investigators also had to communicate with the crisis staff, to whom they passed on their initial findings and agreed on a strategy for further action. As part of a thorough search, all personal items, letters, messages, medicines, and other materials that could give clues as to what had taken place in the house in the last hours and days were removed. No detail was to be overlooked, which meant that on-site investigations took many hours, sometimes all night. One of the first steps after securing the crime scene was to interview all persons who might have any connection or information about the Thaiday family situation. Investigators contacted neighbors, friends of the family, teachers of the children, members of the extended family, and others who had contact with the family. Neighbors' statements were often very emotional, as most of them knew the children personally and considered the family normal, if perhaps a bit closed. Some neighbors described some changes in Raina Thaiday's behavior in the last weeks before the tragedy. They noted, for example, that she was more withdrawn, sometimes seemed nervous or distracted, and sometimes did not want to talk to anyone. One neighbor said that he had heard her talking to herself at night or singing strange songs. Others noticed that the children had been going out less and staying at home more recently, but attributed this to normal tiredness or family responsibilities. When interviewing extended family, it became apparent that several relatives noted changes in Raina Thaiday's mental state. In their words, she had become more religious in recent months, often talking about spiritual matters, prophecies, and the need to protect children from evil. Some relatives described that she cared for her family with great love, but at the same time they observed signs of anxiety and worry in her that she had never had before. Teachers at the school the children attended described that the children were mostly quiet, well-behaved, and never had problems with anyone. No serious complaints about the family were ever recorded. However, one teacher recalled that in recent weeks, some of the children seemed more tired or sad than usual. She also noted that Raina Thaiday had excused herself from several parent-teacher conferences on the grounds that she was tired or could not come because of family problems. Each conversation with persons near and far added small pieces to the mosaic that would later help to understand what exactly was going on in the family and whether any problem was foreseeable. One of the main lines of inquiry was to clarify the possible motivation for the crime. From the outset, investigators focused on the question of whether Raina Thaiday acted in effect under the influence of external circumstances, or whether her motivation was deeply rooted in psychological problems. From the various statements and personal belongings found in the house, a picture began to emerge of a woman who had been experiencing a huge internal struggle for the last few months. Raina often spoke of unseen forces, of the need to protect her children at all costs, and of being threatened by some unnamed evil. The entries in her personal diaries testified to paranoid thoughts, feelings of persecution, fear of the outside world, and the belief that only she could protect her children. One of the key factors investigators examined was the possible influence of religious delusions. According to relatives and some neighbors, Raina Thaiday had begun to exhibit increasingly strong religious motives in her behavior. Long prayers, rituals, strict adherence to certain religious principles, as well as irrational fears of demonic forces. Several months before the tragedy. In some cases, she even tried to convince those around her that the apocalypse was coming, or that there was a need to hide. The changes in her behavior were, according to witnesses, very rapid and visible. The formerly smiling and helpful mother became a woman who appeared confused, often agitated and prone to short bursts of crying or, on the contrary, laughter. Sometimes she was reportedly afraid to leave the house and was convinced that the children were in danger, which she must not tell anyone about. One of the factors that may have played a role in the development of her mental state was the long-term stress of caring for such a large family. Raina Thaiday was practically on her own. The family's financial situation was not easy, and the weight of daily worries fell on her shoulders. Her mental state deteriorated subtly and was only noticed by those around her when it was too late. The investigators also analyzed the possibility that there was some external pressure in the family, such as domestic violence from another party, or that the mother was subjected to pressure from outside, but no direct evidence was found for this hypothesis. All indications were that the main motivation was a deep psychological disturbance which resulted in the tragedy. The forensic investigators spent many hours at the scene, during which they searched in detail not only the house but also its surroundings. They collected a large amount of evidence, from fingerprints and biological traces to personal items and notes. One of the key pieces of evidence was Raina Thaiday's personal diaries. In them, they found notes written at different times. Some were calm, focused on family matters, others were filled with agitated sentences, paranoid thoughts, and warnings of danger. In some of the notes, she described visions, dreams, and hearings that haunted her, especially at night. She also recorded various religious musings and her plans to protect her children from unnamed evils. Police also seized medications and prescriptions that suggested Raina had sought medical help for mental health problems in the past. Some of the medications were for depression, others for anxiety. Leaflets and pamphlets aimed at psychological help and support for parents were also found in the house. Another important piece of evidence was digital traces, such as text messages and emails. Some of these messages contained hints of fatigue, despair, and frustration, while at other times there was an immense love for her children and a desire to protect them from the world. In some messages to loved ones, she wrote that she felt she was being watched or that dark forces were working on her. She also mentioned that she was worried about the future of her children. In the context of all the evidence found, the investigators began to see a picture of a mother who was in the grip of serious psychological problems. These problems had long been overlooked, culminating in a tragedy whose motivation was rooted in deep fear and a sense of helplessness. In this part of the video, I would like to take a detailed look at Raina Thaiday's psychological state as described by various expert reports, testimonies, and as it could be reconstructed from her daily actions, remarks, and behavior before the fatal event. I understand that for many viewers this part may be very sensitive, but I believe that it is a deeper understanding of mental health that can open all of our eyes and help us to perceive similar symptoms in our surroundings. The detailed psychiatric assessments that were carried out after the tragedy clearly confirmed that Raina Thaiday was not suffering from ordinary psychological discomfort, anxiety, or depression at the time of the crime, but was suffering from a widespread and profound mental illness. The experts determined that she was completely under the influence of severe psychosis at the time of the crime. Psychosis is a condition in which a person loses contact with reality, has delusions, hallucinations, and is unable to distinguish correctly between reality and fantasy. For Raina Thaiday, the symptoms of this illness appeared gradually, but in the last weeks and days before the tragedy, her condition deteriorated very rapidly. According to psychiatrists, it was probably a psychosis with religious motives, which is rare but very dangerous if not recognized and treated in time. Psychiatrists who spoke to Raina Thaiday and analyzed her diaries and witness statements described her as being completely delusional at the time of the crime. She believed that she was in direct communication with a higher power, that her children were in danger, and that only she could prevent disaster. Her reality was distorted by inner experiences that have no real basis for the ordinary person. It was evident from the testimonies of family, close friends, and neighbors, as well as from her entries in her personal diaries, that Raina Thaiday had already begun to show signs of a progressively worsening mental disorder several months before the act. At first, there were gradual changes in her behavior. She became withdrawn, less communicative, frequently switched between moods, became irritable, and sometimes melancholic or passive. In the following weeks, those around her began to notice that Raina was suffering from paranoia. She was convinced that she was being watched, that someone was spreading lies about her, that her family was threatened by enemies or evil forces. This manifested itself in her locking the house at unusual hours, checking the locks and windows several times a night, sometimes forbidding her children to go out unaccompanied, or stopping inviting friends to her home. Another disturbing manifestation was hallucinations, mainly auditory and partly visual. On several occasions, Raina reported hearing voices warning her of danger. Sometimes she said she heard directly the voices of God or the voices of angels. There were entries in her diary where she noted what the voices were telling her to do, and some entries were completely disorganized, with rapidly changing topics and sudden jumps in content. Religious delusions became a central part of her illness. She believed that she was the chosen one, that God had given her the special task of protecting children from the forces of hell or the apocalypse. In recent weeks, she increasingly engaged in long prayers and rituals to ensure the protection of her family. Several witnesses reported that Raina told her children strange stories about dangers coming from outside before bedtime and sometimes taught them to repeat prayers or protective incantations. Some days, Raina was obsessed with the idea that she had to purify or protect the children through various rituals. Sometimes she talked about the end of the world being very near. Delusions mingled with everyday reality in her consciousness, so that it was not always clear where reality ended for her and where the inner world full of unseen dangers began. Specific descriptions of anxiety were found in family records and diaries. For example, "Tonight the devil was at our door, I had to pray for an hour." Or, "The children must be cleansed or they will be damned." These entries were sometimes written at night, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, when Raina was often unable to sleep and suffered from severe insomnia. The psychiatrists who were called in to evaluate Raina Thaiday's condition conducted a series of comprehensive examinations, ranging from psychological tests to personal interviews to studies of her behavior after her arrest. Their conclusions were unequivocal. At the time of the crime, Raina Thaiday was in a state of acute psychotic episode that completely dominated her thoughts and actions. The experts described Raina Thaiday's personality before her illness as stable, caring, loving, and devoted to her children with great care. The sudden plunge into psychosis, they said, was probably triggered by a combination of prolonged stress, lack of support, and perhaps a genetic predisposition. It was often repeated in expert reports that she had never had serious conflicts with the law before, had not shown a propensity for violence, and had never endangered those around her. Psychiatrists pointed out that her delusions were strong enough to affect her free will. She was convinced that she was acting for the good of her children, even though from the outside it was a completely incomprehensible and tragic decision. Researchers have also described signs of disorganized thinking, impaired logic, and an inability to critically analyze her own actions. Specific symptoms were also described in expert reports: paranoid delusions, beliefs of constant danger, auditory hallucinations, voices commanding her to do certain things, religious delusions, beliefs of her own special mission. The assessments clearly concluded that Raina's mental state prevented her from fully understanding the real consequences of her actions. According to the experts, extreme fatigue, prolonged stress, isolation from extended family, and lack of contact with a psychiatrist in the last weeks before the crime also played a large role. Some reports even pointed out that quality psychiatric care is not always available in smaller communities, or that there is a stigma attached to such care and people are afraid to talk openly about their problems. Psychiatrists also described that after the crime, Raina went into deep psychological shock and for a long period was unaware of what had actually happened. During interviews, she was often disoriented in time and place. Her answers were confused, and at some points she did not want to comment on the events at all. The conclusion of all the expert reports was that Raina Thaiday was unable to recognize the illegality of her actions at the time of the offense and was not capable of accepting responsibility in the ordinary legal sense. The only solution for her was long-term psychiatric treatment in a secure setting. In this section, I will look in detail at the course of the trial of Raina Thaiday, the court's decision, and the reaction of the public and the victim's family. The aim is to give an insight into the atmosphere in the courtroom, explain the legal arguments of the defense and prosecution, describe the work of the judges and the experts, and give an insight into the personal experiences of all involved. The trial of Raina Thaiday was one of the most watched cases in modern Australian history. The very fact that she was accused of killing 8 young children, including her own niece, generated enormous interest from the media, experts, and the general public. The trial proceeded in several stages and was extremely complicated due to the sensitive nature of the case, the mental state of the defendant, and the need to protect the privacy of the survivors. The trial commenced in Queensland's capital, in one of the largest court complexes, to ensure maximum security as well as adequate space for all involved. The courtroom was packed for several days with journalists, lawyers, experts, and members of the public who came to express their concern or outrage. One of the court's first steps was to examine Raina Thayday's mental state and decide whether she was fit to stand trial and understand the proceedings. It was the analysis of her mental capacity that was crucial. The defense presented expert reports from several independent psychiatrists who agreed that she was suffering from severe psychosis at the time of the offense and was not fully capable of understanding the nature of her actions or their consequences. After a lengthy review of the expert reports and the expert testimony, it was concluded that Raina's current condition did not allow for a traditional criminal trial. The court therefore ruled that any consideration of her guilt and motivation must be conducted with particular regard to her mental state. The entire trial was conducted in the presence of specialized medical professionals and under the close supervision of a judge who had experience in similarly sensitive cases. The court focused in particular on the course of events, the analysis of the evidence, and the assessment of the extent to which Raina Thaiday could have influenced her behavior. Both the prosecution and defense presented detailed time reconstructions, witness statements, expert reports, and medical records. The courtroom also heard emotional testimony from survivors and friends of the family. Issues related to law, ethics, and social responsibility were often addressed during the trial. Defense attorneys emphasized that their client was a victim of her own illness at the time of the crime, and that any criminal liability would be contrary to the principles of justice. In contrast, the prosecution lawyers emphasized the gravity of the crime, the social impact, and the need for a clear position of the court on the issue of child protection and the prevention of similar cases. After several months of carefully examining all the details, hearing testimony, and analyzing the evidence, the judge reached a final decision that was pivotal not only for the defendant herself, but for Australian society as a whole. When it came to the actual verdict, the entire courtroom was filled with tension and anticipation. In his lengthy and carefully worded speech, the judge stated that he had relied primarily on expert evidence and testimony that clearly established Raina Thayday's serious mental disorder at the time of the offense. A key point in the judgment was the recognition that the defendant was incapable of recognizing the illegality of her actions at the time of the offense. The judge emphasized that the decision was not an excuse or justification for the tragedy, but a response to a medically and legally documented condition. In accordance with Queensland law, Raina Thaiday was granted the status of unsound mind at the time of the offense. The court ordered her immediate admission to a secure psychiatric facility specializing in the treatment of persons with severe mental disorders. This facility was chosen to be able to provide not only treatment, but also protection for Raina Thaiday herself, the staff, and the wider community. The decision on the length of hospitalization was left to the discretion of the professionals, who were to keep the court regularly informed of the patient's condition and any prospects for a future return to normal life. The judge also stressed that this measure did not constitute liberation in the ordinary sense of the word. Raina Thaiday was not facing a free life, but long years of treatment and constant supervision. Her condition was deemed so serious that there could be no question of resocialization without thorough and many years of therapy. In the reasons for the judgment, the judge discussed at length the difference between criminal responsibility and an illness that deprives a person of the ability to act freely. He explained that society must be protected from dangerous acts, but at the same time, it is necessary to distinguish between people who act in full consciousness and those who are controlled by a serious illness. The judgment was received with some relief by the professional community, which had feared that possible imprisonment instead of treatment might contravene modern principles of treatment of the mentally ill. The public reaction to the judgment was ambivalent, full of emotion, and provoked considerable social debate. Some people, including sections of the Australian media, expressed relief that the court had taken into account serious mental illness and decided on hospitalization instead of imprisonment. The psychiatric community saw the decision as an important affirmation that mental illness should be taken seriously and that treatment and protection take precedence over repression in such cases. On the other hand, some members of the public were disillusioned by the ruling, with some people expressing their outrage in discussions and on social media, calling for tougher action against people who commit serious crimes, even if they are ill at the time of the offense. Some comments included words to the effect that justice has not been served, that children have no representation, or that the system has failed. These responses often stemmed from a misunderstanding of the principles of criminal law and a deep grief at the loss of so many young lives. The family of the victims reacted very restrained and with great pain. Some members of the extended family have stated in media statements that it is impossible for them to ever fully accept the court's decision because no sentence will ever bring back their children. Others, on the other hand, acknowledged that Raina's condition was so serious that prison was pointless for her, and that the main goal must be to protect society and prevent further similar tragedies. The whole process has sparked a huge debate in Australia about mental health, the availability of mental health care, the protection of vulnerable children, and the role of the state in preventing such acts. At the same time, many people became more aware of mental health problems in their neighborhoods, and several awareness campaigns were created to destigmatize mental illness and promote early intervention. Some non-profit organizations working with families and the mentally ill have hailed the court's decision as an important message in the fight against the stigmatization of mental disorders. However, they also pointed out that prevention, education of field workers, and cooperation between schools, health professionals, and social services needed to be substantially strengthened. In conclusion, the trial and verdict in the Raina Thaiday case was not just a search for guilt or punishment. Above all, it was an attempt to understand how far a neglected mental illness can lead, and a challenge to society as a whole to ensure that tragedies like this never happen again. The judge's decision was not only a legal verdict, but also a moral appeal to the need for empathy, professional help, and responsibility for each of us. This case, full of tragic events and strong emotions, has left a deep mark on Australian society. Not only was the immediate public and media reaction very powerful, but also the longer-term impact on the Cairns community, views on mental health, public attitudes towards the justice system, and general perceptions of child safety. In the following subpoints, I would like to look in depth at how the situation has impacted on different sections of society and what questions and changes the Raina Thaiday case has raised. From the first minutes that news of the Cairns tragedy appeared in the Australian media, it was clear that this case would be one of the most closely watched in the country's modern history. Television stations interrupted their regular broadcasts, dozens of journalists from all over Australia arrived on the scene, and within hours the news was in the foreign media. Reporters detailed the investigation, gathered testimony from neighbours, family, and friends, and brought footage from the scene. Australian newspapers, radio, and television news gave the case prime coverage in the following days. Journalistic teams often worked almost around the clock to bring the latest information, expert comment, and public reaction. Online portals updated the news every hour, and social networks were full of debate, conjecture, expressions of sympathy, and outrage. Terms such as Cairn tragedy, Tragedy of Eight, and Thaiday case entered the mainstream media lexicon. International news agencies such as the BBC, CNN, and Reuters picked up the story within the first day so that the whole world was following developments in Australia. In many foreign media, the analysis of the case was set in a wider context. Mental health, motherhood, and social conditions in Australia were discussed. Some journalists compared the tragedy to other well-known cases of mass murder in the family, which in itself led to intense discussions not only among experts but also among ordinary people around the world. The media attention was enormous and led to the issue of mental health, child protection, and the functioning of the social system suddenly being the focus of attention even in places where hardly anyone had spoken about such issues before. The media also had to deal with criticism. Some viewers and readers found some reports insensitive or overly sensationalist, while others appreciated the emphasis on the human dimension of the case. Among the strongest reactions were immediate expressions of grief and solidarity from the local Cairns community. In the first few hours, people spontaneously began to bring flowers to the entrance of the family home, lighting candles, laying cuddly toys, and writing messages on papers. An impromptu memorial was created on the pavement, which within a few days turned into a sea of flowers and lights. In public places, memorial events were held where people prayed together, shared their grief, hugged each other, and sought words of comfort. Naturally, there were also various charity collections to support the wider family and to fund aid for the bereaved. The local schools where the Thaiday children attended organized special programs, psychological support for classmates, teachers, and parents. The community in Cairns was literally shocked. Many residents had never experienced anything like it, so they sought to support each other both emotionally and practically. Australian society as a whole responded to the case with a huge wave of empathy and questions. Public discussions were sparked at all levels, in families, workplaces, schools, parliament, and social media. People debated how it is possible that something like this happened, whether the tragedy could have been prevented, and what everyone in their neighborhood can do to prevent similar incidents. Calls for better cooperation between schools, doctors, social services, and the police gradually came. Mental health and its long-standing stigma was a particularly strong theme. The public began to reflect more on the fact that mental illness can affect anyone, that mental health care needs to be more accessible, and that society needs to be educated on how to recognize the warning signs and where to seek help. This particular case has been the catalyst for many crucial discussions about mental health in the Australian public. The public, professionals, and politicians have become more aware of the gaps in the care system for people with mental health problems. Questions were raised in the media and in public forums. Why do loved ones or neighbors sometimes not dare to intervene in time? How is it possible that mentally ill parents do not always have sufficient supervision, support, or therapy? Why are some people still afraid to seek help because of shame or fear of stigma? The case of Raina Thaiday has inspired various NGOs and government institutions to launch mental health campaigns. New information websites, helplines, training for teachers, health and social workers have been created. In many Australian states, there have been debates about changing laws to allow earlier intervention for families at risk, and about funding new prevention programs for children and parents. The public discussions included personal stories of people who spoke openly about their experiences of mental health difficulties. Many women, as well as men, shared their struggles with depression, anxiety, psychosis, or burnout, and urged others not to be ashamed to seek support. Support groups and community centers were set up where it was possible to talk anonymously to professionals or to other people going through similar difficulties. The issue of mental health neglect also entered the political debate. Some politicians have called for an increase in the budget for psychiatry, while others have pointed to the need for better integration of health and social services. There were proposals for preventive screening in maternity hospitals, schools, and the availability of crisis intervention. A major impact of this case was that society became more aware of the importance of not underestimating the first warning signs of mental health problems. This was not just a short-term surge of interest, but a real change in attitude in the general public. Schools began to work more intensively with psychologists, and lessons on mental health and domestic violence prevention were included in the curriculum. In some regions of Australia, an early warning system has been introduced whereby schools, doctors, or social workers can more easily alert families in crisis and offer them targeted help. New positions have been created to care for mentally ill parents and children at risk. The media, which was previously often criticized for sensationalism, has begun to work more closely with professionals and offer space for educational programs on mental health, life crises, and help options. In the long term, the case has also influenced views on motherhood, parenthood, and the pressures that some women, especially single mothers, face. The public has become more aware that even seemingly strong mothers can struggle with unspoken fears, stress, or isolation. There has been more talk about the need for community cohesion, shared childcare, and ways to look after one's own psychological well-being without guilt. New debates opened up within Australian families. Parents and children were encouraged to talk more openly with each other about their feelings, fears, and mental well-being. Support groups for children in difficult family situations have been established in some schools, and school counselors have begun to work more closely with families to address crises. All in all, the Raina Thaiday case has shaken the foundations of Australian society far more deeply than anyone would have expected. It has brought into the public arena issues that had long been taboo. It has changed the way we look at the importance of looking after not only physical health, but also mental health. It has made people more vigilant, more empathetic, and more willing to help others not only when it is too late. The final part of my video is always dedicated not only to summarizing the main takeaways, but also to reflecting deeply on what the story can bring to our lives. The case of Raina Thaiday is etched in the collective memory of Australia and has left imprints in the conscience of many people around the world. It is not just a tragedy that happened at a particular time and place. It is a subject that touches everyone who has ever thought about the meaning of family, mental health, solidarity, and responsibility. In this chapter, I will look at the main points of the conclusion and lessons as I see them as the narrator and author of this channel. The case of Raina Thaiday represents an extremely rare but all the more shocking tragedy that affected a family, a community, and an entire society. The main pillars on which an understanding of this case rests are a few basic insights. It is a situation where the mother of a large family, surrounded by daily worries, the weight of responsibility and internal struggle, gradually succumbed to a severe mental illness. In a state in which she was unable to distinguish reality from delusions and hallucinations, a tragedy occurred that changed the lives of many people forever. Several key points emerged from the case. The first is that mental illness can affect anyone, regardless of age, character, education, or social status. The second is that mental health difficulties often remain hidden or underestimated for a long time, both by the person themselves and by those around them. The third and very important lesson is that the support and prevention system must be robust enough to intervene early, even where the situation is complex and subtle. As a fourth point, I would say that in moments of greatest adversity, a community can show strength, cohesion, and true humanity. People in Cairns and across Australia have come together to honor the memory of the victims, to support the survivors, and to speak openly about what was previously taboo. The fifth key insight is that justice is not always just a matter of punishment, but also of truth-seeking, understanding, and prevention. One of the greatest benefits of this case is that it has opened up a space for discussion of issues that have long been neglected or considered too difficult. First and foremost is the question of how to effectively care for people suffering from mental illness. The case of Raina Thaiday has shown that basic health care or a one-off intervention is not enough. What is needed is long-term, continuous, and comprehensive support that includes health, social, family, and community components. Important questions were raised. How do you know if someone in your neighborhood has a serious mental illness? When do you need to intervene? How and where to seek help? For many people, this case became an impetus to think about their own family, neighbors, colleagues, and their own mental health. Another key issue is the safety and protection of children. The case has shown that even in families where there is no apparent problem, there can be situations where children are not safe enough. This has led to open debates about what tools schools, doctors, or neighbors have when they suspect a child is at risk. There has been a strong emphasis on educating professionals, implementing prevention programs, and bringing together more of all the elements that can catch children at risk early. The case of Raina Thaiday has also raised the issue of personal responsibility on everyone's part. What should we do when we notice changes in the behavior of someone close to us? When is it our duty to offer help, and when is it our duty to directly demand it? The theme of solidarity and civic courage suddenly ceased to be abstract and became a personal matter for each individual. One of the biggest lessons we can take away from this case is the need to be much more receptive and sensitive to mental health issues. Mental health is not just the absence of illness, it is a state of well-being, the ability to cope with the normal challenges of life, to build relationships, to work, and to rest. Unfortunately, the stigma associated with mental illness is still strong, and many people are afraid to admit their difficulties for fear of being misunderstood, judged, or disadvantaged. The case of Raina Thaiday shows that a lack of openness, prevention, and early help can have fatal consequences. That is why it is very important to build an environment where it is normal to talk about one's feelings, where it is normal to seek professional help, and where people are not ashamed to admit that they cannot cope alone. Each of us can be a support to our loved ones, whether it is by talking, sharing experiences, or telling them that there are concrete ways to help. A key lesson is also that mental health is just as important as physical health. Just as we do not hesitate to see a doctor with a toothache or fever, we should not hesitate to see a psychologist, psychiatrist, or other professional if we notice long-term anxiety, sadness, irritability, or changes in behavior. Open communication and mutual support can save lives. In addition to individual responsibility, there is also a challenge for the state and society. Adequate funding for psychiatric care, the availability of crisis centers, the training of professionals, and public campaigns to break down myths about mental illness are all necessary. Every child, every parent, every person should be able to turn to help before it is too late. At the very end of my video, I would like to dwell on values that we often only realize when a life crisis hits us directly, or through a powerful story like that of Raina Thaiday. Empathy, the ability to empathize with others, and solidarity, the willingness to help, are not just empty concepts. They are values that can make the difference in practice between life and death, between loneliness and hope. The case of Raina Thaiday is a memento that each of us can be a source of support for those around us. Sometimes all it takes is a small gesture, an offer of a conversation, a reminder of the possibility of professional help, or simply a show of concern. If someone had been there at the right time to lend Raina a helping hand, the whole tragedy might have turned out differently. That is why it is important not to ignore the warning signs and to be ready to actively help. Empathy and solidarity do not only manifest themselves in times of crisis, but are the basis of everyday relationships. In communities where people talk to each other, where they are not afraid to ask for help, where they support each other, there is much less risk of despair, loneliness, and hopelessness. I myself try to create a safe space on my channel for sharing, understanding, and open debate. Finally, I would like to encourage you all. Don't be afraid to be receptive, active, and open. If you feel that someone in your neighborhood needs help, try to offer support. If you are struggling with any psychological stress yourself, do not hesitate to reach out to professionals, helplines, or community centers. None of us are alone in the world, and even in the most difficult times there is a path to light. The case of Raina Thaiday shows how fragile the human mind can be, and how much responsibility we all have not only for ourselves, but also for those around us. Let us remember this, and strive every day to help make the world a little safer, kinder, and more cohesive. If you found this conclusion interesting, I'd love it if you'd post your thoughts in the comments. Share what struck you most about the case, and what lessons you take away from it yourself. Thank you for watching to the end, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next video.